So as you can see, my name is CJ. My last name is Hurd. I work for a company called Compass IT Compliance, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, worked with. We do a lot of these presentations with ISACA, which has been great, great experience for all of us. So kind of how did I get here talking to you guys? So I've been with Compass for going on 4 years now, and they did a heck of a job pulling me out of the United States Coast Guard. I had worked in the Coast Guard for 21 years when they came calling, managing cybersecurity for 18 of those years. Was awarded the Coast Guard's Information Security Officer of the Year 3 years in a row in 2015, 16, and 17. Before retiring in 2018. I also won the award for the Department of Homeland Security, who the Coast Guard works for. So, been doing this for a while. And one thing that I would say was newer to me when I kind of came over to Compass was in working with people in the private sector, was managing vendor risks. In the military, we have kind of one criteria when we pick a vendor. It's the lowest bidder, as you probably may have heard. We do have a lot of controls, so we limit that vendor access. So when we're choosing a vendor, it's usually for a long contract, and it's based on the lowest bid, and that contract's hard to get out of. So you get your first year experience with them and say, hey, these guys are awful. This is not working. This is not meeting the requirements, the contract, the SLA, and there's not a lot you can do. We're an organization of 38,000 people at that point, and there's not a lot we can do. Those decisions have been made. They were budgeted long before it got to us. Transition to the private sector here, and for me and with Compass, we do this with other organizations. We work as their virtual CISO, and I manage that vCISO practice for Compass, and to be able to go into a company and help manage their vendor risks, help establish a program, help vet the vendors. And again, it's more in real time than what my past life was. And again, it's that life is getting further and further behind me, but learning a lot as we have gone through this. So with these vendor risks, with these bringing a vendor on, with these establishing what our criteria is going to be, it's real time. Someone's coming to you and we need to move fast, right? We're in a fast world. We need to move fast. Hey, I need this vendor. Okay, well, that's great, but we need to go through a process. Do you have a process? Why do we have that process? So kind of as you see here with my first slide, with all that said, why do we care about vendor management? Well, there's many reasons, right? First off, our own risk, our own trying to be risk averse, our own trying to identify any risks that exist in our organization, within our environment, right? So now you see in the slides here, you've got regulatory compliance. We're all getting audited. Any company that we work for, we work with, there's audits, whether it's a partner, it's an internal, whether it's through a security questionnaire, before we can sign a contract with somebody, to provide support, before that relationship even starts. Someone's asking what we do, how we do it, what controls we have in place, what does our security program look like? Same thing, they're managing their risks. Maybe we're getting a third-party audit. We're going through a SOC audit that we're sharing with external entities. So that's that regulatory compliance that we're trying to balance, and we're always being adhered to. We know the annual assessments, that's part of almost any security policy that you would have, and that's standard. If you're not being assessed annually, then you're probably not doing what you say you're supposed to be doing, or say you are doing. So that vendor management program and how you handle it is a big part of those assessments. We want to reduce that supplier risk. These suppliers are a huge risk to us, and it's a huge dependency for us. Some things that you'll hear me probably say multiple times, it's that dependency. We have a dependency on these suppliers, on these vendors. They provide a critical service for us and to our customers and to our clients. So we need to make sure that we're managing that risk the right way and identifying it. Again, anybody in this call knows that the last thing we want to do is just ignore any risk. Accepting risk is okay. Identify it, accept it. Why do we accept it? We document that exception. We do not want to ignore that risk. When we get a new vendor, How do we onboard that vendor? Are we going through the proper channels to onboard that vendor properly? And we'll go through that throughout this presentation. But in terms of onboarding them contractually, identifying those risks early on before we even go through the contracting process and reviewing the SLAs. What kind of access are they going to have? Do we know what that access looks like? Have we documented it? 6 months from now, is it still the same? Are we okay with it? Have we reviewed to make sure that, hey, this doesn't line up with what we thought it would be? Are we looking at that, continuously monitoring what that looks like? Having that transparency across the organization. I love transparency. I love the word transparency. I like to know what's going on. I don't want to be kept in the dark. Transparency works in some cases. Again, I'm a big need to know guy, right? I come from 21 years in the military doing this. We restrict everything. We try to restrict everything based on need to know. But certain things, we have a vendor, we want transparency. We want you to know what the expected outcome should be. And if it's different, we want you to say something to us. We want you to speak up. We like expected outcomes and like to know what those expected outcomes are. And we want it to be that way. We don't like the unexpected during these situations. That's where that risk increases. And maybe you see that, but have we identified that risk? Have we documented it? Have we documented when we don't get the expected outcome? Cost is always going to be an issue. Money will always be the root of all evil. We're always going to be making sure we get the best cost, whether we can save a nickel here or a dime here. We're always trying to have cost savings. Can we compare what we have with one vendor to what another vendor could be? Have we identified alternatives? So if maybe we do have a critical vendor, somebody who's critical to our services that we're providing, and they do go, belly up for whatever reason, do we have an alternative, right? Or even if it's not because they go belly up because, hey, we're not really getting what we're paying for, do we have an alternative? Is it cheaper? No, it's more expensive. Okay, but is there more value there? So making sure we've done that due diligence, not only on the risk side, but on that financial side. And we're willing to accept some risk based on cost savings, maybe, or there's some risk we're not willing to accept, and we'll rather pay the extra money to make sure we're getting the most value out of the product that we want or the vendor that we have. We want to maintain those relationships, right? If we do this right from the start, we've set our expectations, right? We've managed our expectations. We've managed their expectations. We've communicated. We've built that relationship up. So now when something does go wrong, we have an avenue to go down, to maybe fix the relationship, get what we want out of this relationship, identify those risks, and then remediate those risks. Or maybe some relationships aren't something that can be mended. Maybe they've the service just isn't there. This isn't what we thought we were getting. That expected outcome is not what we are getting, and it doesn't meet the contractual requirements that we set. It doesn't meet the SLA, and we're going to move on. And fortunately, we've done our due diligence and we know of alternatives. We know it fits the budget. We've done our homework and we're prepared for this. And we always want to improve. We're not going backwards. We're always going forwards. We're always getting better. We're always getting more efficient. We're always getting more proficient. We're doing better. We're hiring better people who may be smarter than you or me, that may have more knowledge in an area. And we want to lean on them for that process improvement. If they bring a vendor to us, we don't want to just disregard it. We want to vet them. Is there a business case for it? Does it fit into the budget? Again, all things that we'll go into as we go through. And again, as we do this, again, I have a bottle of water sitting here that I'd love to take a sip out of every once in a while. So if you do have a question, again, hit Josh up. I don't know if we have a representation from Compass here named Jeff Yeagley. If you can, message him, he can always interrupt with what the question is, and I'm happy to take questions as we go. So don't hesitate to interrupt, and allow me to take a quick water break. So I'm going to kind of hit it right off the start here, and we're going to talk about some of the recent supply chain hacks that have happened, and I'm going to call out two in particular. One here with SolarWinds and with Kaseya. So I went through this, knowing that I was going to be giving this presentation, and ironically, we knew this is the date set for this one a long time ago, and whether it was before these hacks happened or not. So again, really makes this a relevant topic. So I went through, I do these vendor due diligence reviews for multiple companies, and we do them a lot, and not just me, but others at Compass as well. And bounce this idea, this thought off of some other people. What would they have done? How would they have reviewed these two companies? And I went through SolarWinds, and I said, okay, let's pretend that I'm looking at SolarWinds before the hack. I didn't know the hack happened, right? Immediately you see this hack happened, and maybe there's a while where you have to reject them because we don't know if there's any residual effects from the hack. Again, it's unfortunate, but when I reviewed SolarWinds, went to their trust center, saw what I could get publicly. By all accounts, they're a 5-star company. By all accounts, they have their security program. They're ISO certified. They go through an annual SOC 2 Type 2 audit. They're a Privacy Shield member, as you see here, GDPR compliant, go through a Sarbanes-Oxley audit, every year. And it's all something available, all something that you can get. By all accounts, if I'm doing an initial risk review on them, from a vendor risk standpoint, I would have, I can't sit here and tell you that I would have, or that any of you would have denied them, that would have rejected them as a potential vendor for your company. On the surface, they are doing everything. Could the hack have been avoided? Again, that's not for me. That's not for me to say. I would be lying to you if I said I knew every nook and cranny about it. But it did happen, and to go beforehand, I think that's something based on what I can read on the Trust Center and how I would have done my review, I would have approved them. Now on Kaseya, as I look back, now again, looking back is easier. So when I look back and I try to compare them even to SolarWinds, on there, what they provide is they say that their data center is certified to be ISO 27001. Okay, it's great that your data center is, but have your controls been measured? The people who access those data centers, are they following the same ISO controls? Nowhere can I find that they've been audited by a third party, and that it's something that I can review. On their site, they also provide a SOC 3 report, which is a public report, and it's redacted. It talks about the organization, but does not include the actual controls that were tested as well as the results. So with that, I can't see that they had a vulnerability that had been exploited, a patch that hadn't been patched for a long time. I couldn't see that an auditor went in and saw that they were reviewing, comparing back-to-back vulnerability reports, and that they had patching reports that said that these vulnerabilities have been patched in a timely manner. What their policies say, whether they're critical and high vulnerabilities are patched within 15 days or is it 30 days. I can't see any of that. They don't have anything that is there that says they're members of these organizations. They're going through these third-party audits. So when I look back, I like to think that based on what I see, again, I have the power of having to look back. I like to think that I would have rejected them as a vendor based on just not having enough information, or would have wanted them to fill out my security questionnaire to answer my questions. Answering my questions and providing evidence that shows that you've done these things. Whether they would or not, a lot of these companies that I would be asking from would be smaller than Kaseya, and they probably tell me to pound sand. And with that, I'd read a report that said that I don't approve them going forward. They can, from a management level, can override me, but I would not approve them. I like to think that I would say that. I can't sit here and unequivocally say I would have, because again, they're a big player. They were known in the vertical. But looking back, looking at what I see now, I wouldn't approve them, with what I see now. So kind of two examples of companies as we look back that we know they've had a unfortunate event in the last year. And as you look back again, I like to say I would not have approved Kaseya, but I think when looking at SolarWinds, I would have approved them based on the third-party audits they do and the documentation that is available. So a risk review. So when I do my initial risk review, right? So, and I'll kind of go to the next slide. I'm going backwards here intentionally. So when I do a risk review, so we get a vendor that we're going to onboard. So I get a request. After that request has kind of gone through its other stages of approval, and if I'm going to go do a review of a potential vendor, I'm going to start with sending them my security questionnaire. Chances are they're not going to fill it out. Again, especially if they're bigger than me. If I'm talking about an AWS, a Microsoft, they're not filling out my questionnaire. You've even got smaller companies that are say, here's my SOC report, which I'm happy to have and happy to review. That's again a third-party audit review that I think is very valuable. Third party has gone in and measured these controls. If I can see an ISO certification, if I can see another third-party audit, whether it's a NIST, an ISO, maybe not a certification, but a risk assessment, whether it's a HIPAA, some of these other frameworks that we would look at, some kind of third-party review that shows me that somebody else has looked at these things from an objective level.
Hey, CJ.
Yeah.
As part of that, there was a question in the chat about whether a company like BitSite or maybe Security Scorecard or something like that be able to help, like in the CASB one.
Yes, so I can't see that. I'm sorry, I get with my screen the way it's get the slide on there. I can't see the question, so I appreciate you jumping in and got it. And the answer is absolutely. Again, a lot of third-party vendor programs, services out there, which can absolutely lend a hand. It's hard for us to search for every little thing. So any advantage we can get, whether it's a Gartner site, an Insight, a Wistic, some of these third-party programs that can help us look at our vendors and get there with what they've researched, what they've seen. They're certainly searching a lot more things than we have. So if your company has a subscription to something like that, can you get a subscription to something like that? Absolutely, those can absolutely help you in these situations. And again, I'd like to say, if I went back a slide, I'd love to go back, and something I should do is go back and see, what would they have said about solar. I don't know if I can get that information now, but if I can go back to before these hacks happened, what would they have said about a SolarWinds or a Kaseya? That's something I'd love to go back to and see what they said about it. My guess, and it's only a guess, is that they say the same thing that I'm saying. There's no reason that they would not approve SolarWinds. Kaseya, maybe they have some questions on. So no, absolutely, those different third-party programs, absolutely a great friend for you to have in this vertical. So as we go back to talking about the initial review, and again, please keep coming in with the questions, as you have them. So again, taking that third-party program is great, is an absolutely great tool, and can be leaned on in any of these situations. So again, don't omit that. Don't leave it over here. Don't leave it. Keep it in the conversation. I'm not specifically, talking about that in this, but again, an absolutely great tool they can help you come up with some of these answers. They've got those questionnaires in there. They may have some audit reports in there. Somebody has reviewed them, and you get their 2 cents as well. So again, an absolute great tool that I don't want to just skip over by talking about this. So again, if I can send out my questionnaire and they can answer it, if I can review one of their third-party audits, again, that's great for me. Will they send me? Can I review their security policy, their program review? A lot of that will be tied to that security questionnaire, right? And am I using trying to mention too many programs here, but a Wistic, where maybe that stuff has already been put in there. These third-party vendor programs, one of the difficulties that I've seen with them is they don't work with each other. So you take an A and a B, and if I get a questionnaire from again, I mentioned Wistic already, Wistic may not talk to one of the other vendor management programs. So if I put my information into a Wistic and somebody who's reviewing me does not use Wistic, then they can't necessarily see it, and they still want me to fill out their questionnaire. It's going to be vice versa. If I'm asking them and I'm using something like a Wistic, I can't get their information because they're in a different program. I've done a lot of demos with these companies, and there's nothing in place right now for them to talk to each other, which makes it difficult. So when you don't have that, you're not members with multiple vendor management programs, you're kind of stuck doing the research on your own, which can certainly be a lot more difficult, by all means. So now, if we don't have a Wistic, can we get a copy of what your security policies look like? What's in there? Again, with that third-party audit, to me, ties it together. It's great that you have policy, but how do I know that you're actually adhering to your own policies, right? That's where that third-party audit, if I can review that report, that's going to give me that inside look that somebody has looked at your evidence, has looked at your artifacts, has looked at your operating controls, to make sure you're doing X, Y, and Z that exists in your security policies. And then again, if is there a contract in place? Is there an MSA? a DPA, something that we can review, the SLAs, it's a lot of A's, that we can review to make sure that we know the contract looks like, what the SLA is. Are you adhering to our SLA? Are we adhering to your SLA? When that relationship happens, if we're sharing information, what are you doing with our information? What's your retention schedule? What's your data protection program look like? Again, a lot of pieces that go with this that we want to be comfortable with before we go sign a 1 year or multi-year type contract with you. And a lot of that depends on the level of access you have to our systems. A lot of the ways that I approach this with a lot of it is that risk level. So if I'm looking at a bigger type vendor, let's go with an AWS as an example. Is AWS a critical vendor? So to me, everybody looks at it differently. A lot of the ways that I look at this, AWS to me is a critical vendor because they're a critical vendor to me. If something happens to them, if the supply chain breaks with them, then I'm in a lot of trouble. I'm in a lot of trouble as it relates to meeting my SLAs. I have a large dependency on an AWS. Do they have security controls in place? By all means, they go through as many audits as anybody else, as many third-party looks as anybody else. They have as many controls in place as anybody else. So am I worried about their controls failing? Probably less than maybe I'll use a Kaseya as an example. I'm less concerned about theirs breaking, but they are a bigger target because they're AWS, and they are a larger dependency to the services that I provide. So for those reasons, they're a critical vendor for me. So when I'm going through that, what kind of access do they have to my systems, to my data? Am I sharing sensitive organizational information with them? Am I supplying sensitive employee information or client data? What kind of information do they have access to? If they have access to all that, I consider them more of a critical type vendor, critical or a high risk vendor. If they don't have access to that, then maybe they're less of a critical vendor to, as my scale goes. And I'll show you what mine looks like, as well as how hard would it be to replace them. So if something happened to AWS, we weren't happy with them for whatever reason. They weren't meeting their SLAs. We weren't happy with the cost. We found an alternative, or their services went down. How long would it take me to replace them? Well, something like AWS would take me a long time. Something like a third-party provider, maybe a lot less. Am I longer than a week? Am I less than a week? Am I longer than a month? Am I shorter than a month? What does that time frame look like? Again, AWS, maybe a bad example because we know they're going to be a long time. Some of these smaller vendors, maybe it's a lot quicker. So that would determine that risk level, whether it's high, medium, or low. So this is probably small on your screen, but this is an idea of what the vendor evaluation and risk calculator that I'll run a company through. So again, with these companies I work with, I do a risk review on my own company. So I represent Compass IT Compliance. We're a vendor for a lot of these companies that we work with. So we do a vendor review. What kind of access do we have? Whether it's, like I mentioned, company, employee, or customer information. We've got access to all of it because of the reviews that we're doing and the role that we're playing. How quickly would you need to replace us? How long would it take you to replace us? It wouldn't take long, right? So we could be replaced in this case less than a month. Vet somebody and be good to go that way. And if we went belly up, right? If we just stopped returning phone calls, again, that would never happen. But if we stop returning phone calls, we don't get emails, our systems are down. How long would it go before you'd face significant issues? And the answer, truthfully, is you could go longer than a week. You'd be okay without us for a week. But that's kind of how I run through this process to help identify what a critical vendor is. And other people may have different ways of doing it. And there are different ways of doing it based on that risk, right? So some of these vendors are higher risk based on the security controls that they have. And again, from my standpoint, I'm not approving them if I have an issue with their security controls. If they don't have security controls, I'm not approving them. That is not an approach that I want to take. Here's an example. So So again, as we get to the next, before we get to the next slide, so we had a company that I do this with. They have a process where they submit a ticket. So there's a vendor request form. They fill out a form. The employee fills out a form. It gets submitted through a help desk ticket. From that help desk ticket, it goes to their manager, and that manager would approve it from a business standpoint. From there, it goes through finance. By then, then it goes through a security review. When it gets to the security review, I'm doing that security review, whether it's using some of the tools that you guys have mentioned, or doing my own research, my own recon. I'm going to come up with an approval or a rejection. In this case, you can see this one with Clubhouse drop in audio. So I didn't approve it. I did some research and again, fortunately found something about the Chinese company called Agora that managed their back-end operations. I had an article that I read through, raised a lot of alarms, and I didn't approve it based on that information. And again, stand by it. And again, I think that's the approach that for me, I'm going to take. There's something that raises a flag for me, I'm not going to approve them. If I can get their SOC report, if I can get a third-party audit report, that's great. But if I see something like I read in that LA Times article, that's something that I'm not comfortable with, and I can't approve based on that information that I have. And I'm responsible to bring that forward and reject it and make sure they don't go forward with that vendor. So talking about that vendor approval process, we talk a lot about security. A lot of what who we are on this call is our IT or our security. It's not just a security process, right? So we talked about a little bit, I mentioned the business case, right? So anytime we're going to have a new vendor, there needs to be a business case. We don't just take on every vendor just because we want to, just because somebody down the chain thinks there might be a need. We have an approval process, and part of that approval process is the business case. I want to have a vendor request process. I want to have a form. I want somebody to have to actually do the work to request it. I want them to review that vendor on their own. Why do we need this? What do they do for us? What costs? Do some legwork on your end, because if it's something that we truly need, it needs to be an entire team that's looking at this, not just one person. Not just from a security standpoint. I can't answer whether it fits into your need operationally. I can do the security side of things. You could do the security side of things, but I can't answer the business case for you. And that's got to be done by you. That's got to be done by your manager and the people in your department who are going to be using this particular vendor. Maybe it's at a higher level. Maybe that's at the CEO level or the CFO level. There's approving it, or the COO level that's approving it. But it has to get to that point to be approved as an organization first. From there, where does it fit in from a budget standpoint? Can we afford this? Have we budgeted for this? Is it not in this year's budget? Do we have to put this in the list for the next year, for the planning meeting, for next year's strategic meeting, to get it added to the budget, for next year? I talked about the military side. We're 3 years out. If we brought in something that had a high price tag, we were always 3 years out. We were a 3-year cycle. And what made it tough is once you earmark something 3 years ago to start in, say, 2022, it was hard to get it off the list if you had to change your mind or something, a new priority came up. So it became very difficult in doing it that way. A lot of the organizations we work with, it's not as difficult to maybe get something approved or adjust the budget. In our planning meetings, maybe we have a miscellaneous budget where we can get something like this approved. But again, not just security. We need to get that approved from a business standpoint and from a cost, a financial standpoint. From there, as we've gone into, once it's already approved there, now we're going to spend our time from that security level to review it and make sure that it fits in to what our risk appetite might be. Are we willing to take on this risk? How critical is this to us? Do we already have something like this? When we maintain this, we're going to put this onto a tracker. We're going to know whether we have things that, hey, we already have something that does this. Can we just use this? We don't want to take on too many vendors. We don't want to have 1,000 vendors that we now have to manage. Because again, that still falls under someone else's responsibility. It doesn't just go away once we sign a contract, once we approve a vendor. The responsibility, from our organization does not stop. So I mentioned that inventory, that tracking of it. Once we approve a vendor, it's going to go onto our vendor tracker. So this is an example of one that I work with a company. And again, we've got the vendor there, we've got the purpose there, we've got the classification, the information that we're sharing that they have access to. We have an owner, someone who's an admin, for this particular vendor. A lot of times that admin is who governs that access, right? Who's setting up that access, who's removing that access, who's reviewing that access, right? These are some of those ongoing tasks that come with any vendor that we might have. What team do they fall under? And then we get into the price, right? Price is important. Whenever we're going to do what we talked about, the price isn't going away. We're always trying to save money here and there. We're always trying to define that value. So understanding the price, as you can see, it's taking up 3 or 4 columns here. That price is very important when we're doing a review. We want to know what the cost is, and are we getting what we need out of that vendor? That's going to be part of that annual review. You can see here, these have all been reviewed within the last year. And Aptable, who again is hosting their AWS instance in this case, they're a high risk vendor. They're a critical risk for this company, a high dependency, and we're really leaning on them for a lot of things in terms of managing that security, managing that AWS instance, and a lot of the security that comes with it. So we want to make sure we're reviewing them, that they're meeting the SLAs, and that we're getting the information that we need out of them. And they're not cheap. So again, we want to make sure we're looking at that.
Hey, CJ, it's Josh again. One quick thing, we've had some more people join during this, so I just wanted to reiterate that please, for CPEs, if you logged in, please change your username to your first and last name so that we can grant you the rights. And also, there is another question around in the chat around if cannot the security review be done or started when the ticket was logged, i.e., before finance went to pay for it?
It can be, yes. So a lot of that's going to depend on how you guys operate within your organization. So it can be. So if you can start reviewing it and you can start saying, okay, I'm going to get ahead of this. Maybe I have some cycles to go look at this. I'm going to start doing it. However, if it's not approved from a business standpoint, if it's not approved from a cost standpoint, but you can get ahead of it and help out as well, because you can say, maybe you catch already that we already have this. Hopefully we talked about transparency earlier on. Hopefully that vendor tracker, finance knows about that as well. Department heads, depending on how big your organization is, they know about what exists as well. So if somebody from their organization is asking for a product or a vendor or a service that you already have, I truly hope that their department head knows about it. If not, we're going to be able to remind them that, hey, this already exists. Here's where the vendor tracker is. If you ever want to look at this, here's our approved vendor list. But you absolutely can start that anytime. Again, every organization is going to be different with how we want to proceed. In my case, as a fractional employee, so I work with these companies from a fractional standpoint. So, we do their, manage their security program, and may not see the ticket right away. So we're dependent on that hiring manager or finance sending us that ticket. So that's when we're actually seeing it. So when you're a fractional employee, like we are, working with an organization, we may not see it in real time like you might if it's internal to your organization. So again, with my 2 cents is the order can go in any order it needs to for you, for what works best for your organization. So if you want to review it security wise before you waste the department head's time or finance's time, then that is absolutely fine. But we want to make sure that we're having it all at all 3 levels, from the business standpoint, from the finance standpoint, and from the security standpoint. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. While you're getting a drink of water, there's another question in the chat in which the requester uses ServiceNow. Where can they see the procurement RFPs, etc.?
Sorry, can I elaborate there? It's a nuance to what the speaker was saying about it depends on the organization's procurement processes. So where I was working in a regulated health entity, we tried to get the security review in as early as possible, because sometimes the vendor, even if we're not using them already, which is another question we ask, or we are using it, but we find out that of 3 initial choices, one really has some lousy security and would be, it's not worth the time for finance to even look at it. Yeah. So that's one argument for starting earlier, but I appreciate it just depends on the company's process.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, and that's great. And again, I love the RFP process, and I love the fact that you have, hey, we got 3 to choose from, right? We're not, and again, a lot of this varies depending on the size of the organization, right? So you have that RFP process is usually for that larger organization, which is a great process, right? You're basically vetting 3. You're not just kind of deciding on one without knowing what 2 other alternatives might be. And that's a great process. And when you have that process, a lot of times you've already budgeted for something. You've already had that strategic planning, and you've already kind of decided as an organization that we have a need for this. This doesn't exist. And you've probably been part of that meeting. So I think that RFP process is ideal. Maybe again, doesn't work for every organization, but if you can vet that from a security standpoint early on, I think it's great. It might save cycles on somebody else. But like I said, it just depends on how your organization is built and what your procedures are. But all 3 levels to me are very important. And you can't have, I don't think you can miss one of them. You need to have all 3 to really have a good, strong program.
Yes, I suppose too. Then I was coming from as you said, the larger organization, so that I had tweaked or had crystallized it, that the finance in effect had already set aside, earmarked funding. It's just a matter to get the right vendor. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a great it's a great process too when you can do it that way. And really, to me, tells you guys are having that communication at that high level and early on, so you're not just kind of reacting. You're planning properly, and you guys are all working, succinctly to make that decision. So it sounds like you guys have a good program. So,
that's an offline
question after that. I'd love to have it.
Sometimes we know, and sometimes we know after the decision has already been made.
Yeah, and again, I think too,
it depends on how the size of the. That does depend. If it's getting a new LAN or WAN, then that's a big issue. But if it's someone to do a little task, then we're the last to hear. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think and unfortunately that's probably normal. Those things fall out of that normal planning. Planning cycle. But again, as long as you still go through that same process, I think it's okay. And I think it's probably frustrating. I can see being frustrating being the last to know. But I guess maybe hearing from my side, being that when you know you're going to be the last to know, like I do as the fractional contractor type, consultant type. I've already accepted that I got a small window to review this because it's already been decided that it's operationally needed. So that's where I tell my wife that I'll be late to dinner and I'm going to go do this, and I'll be up as soon as I can. So no, thank you for your question.
Okay.
And I like the conversation, and again, it certainly helps me. It's nice for everybody to hear a second voice. I think sometimes hearing one voice for a full hour, or however long it goes, can be hard. So again, thank you for the questions and the conversation. So again, we're not only we not done yet, but we're never going to be done. As long as you have a vendor, as long as you have a business, you're always going to be reviewing your vendors. And the minute you stop, then either you're not working there anymore, you don't care anymore, or the company doesn't care anymore. Again, we need to be reviewing these at least annually. Again, I think I like to use the word continuous. I hate continuous for everything, but I think continuous in this case is very important. We want to be having constant communication about the vendors that we work with. Again, I always have security first because that's who I am. But is it meeting the performance operationally? Are they meeting the SLA, the contractual requirements that have been set, that we signed, that we reviewed, that we agreed upon? Are they meeting that? Do we feel like, when we're reviewing the logs, when we're monitoring the activity, do we feel like it's secure? Do we feel like our data is secure? Again, we owe it to our customers, to our clients, to our employees, to our organization as a whole to protect that data. And sometimes that extends outside of our organization. And when we bring on a third party, that's an extension of our organization. So we need to make sure that they are as secure with that data and protecting that data the same way we would, because again, that's part of the contract. That's part of the expectation. That's the expected outcome, is that you will protect that data the same way that we would. You'll comply with our security policies. That's what we're asking of you. And maybe you didn't ask them that of them. I think you should be. I think that's the level that you should be, the baseline you should be establishing. And if you're not, maybe that's something you go back and look at your program. And sometimes they can't. But again, I'd rather know that they say, hey, this is where we might be weak. We can accept that risk and continue on with you, but we can't ignore it. And I think if we don't ask the question, then we're ignoring that potential risk. Yeah, we talked about the performance financials. How is their company doing? We want to look at, do they have a SOC 1 report? That SOC 1 report is more of a financial report. Are they in good standing financially? And they can say it's not our business, but it is our business. We're paying you, and we have a dependency on you. You're a critical vendor for us. You're in our supply chain. We can't. Go through a SOC 2 audit, subservice organization. If you ever go through, a SOC audit yourself, help somebody with a SOC 2 audit, we have subservice organizations. These are those organizations that are critical to our service delivery. We can't do it without this third party, without this vendor. So we want to know your financials. We want to have an idea that something's not going right before we find out the hard way. So reviewing those financials on a yearly basis, if you can review it, publicly. If there's something you can ask them for directly, maybe a harder type question. What's the cost to you? Is this costing more than they said it would? Are there hidden costs, hidden fees that you didn't know about? Is the cost aligning with the performance, with what you expected to get out of this product, or to get out of this vendor? And then doing comparisons. When I do an initial review, again, if I went back to, I took them out of here because I didn't want to show any Encompass's competitors. But when I come here, you see potential alternatives. When I do this for an organization, I list the potential alternatives to Compass IT compliance. If we aren't giving you the value that we say we're going to, if we end up being more expensive and aren't meeting what we said we would do for you, here's 2 alternatives that you can go talk to and go look at. I'll even talk to them for you if you want me to. Again, with any situation, we want to make sure you're getting the value for what you're paying for. And we do those comparisons ahead of time. I want to have already vetted somebody. Again, speaks to the RFP process we were talking about. If you go through an RFP process and you have 2 that are neck and neck, and I choose one over the other, and maybe it's because I flipped a coin, right? Maybe they were so close, same price, same everything, and I flipped a coin. Well, guess what I have? I have an alternative. The other one doesn't meet my expectations. This process is no different. It's not an RFP process, but we're measuring competitors based on what the industry recommends. So again, those comparisons, do them initially, but like I said, it never ends. Keep looking. The market changes quickly, especially here in 2021, as unfortunately summer ends. Here in as we get through August, but those comparisons need to be happening at all times, and stay with who an alternative might be. So when you're doing that annual review the alternatives that you had from last year, and see if there's anybody who may replace one of those alternatives. It doesn't take that much extra time to do it. And then again, we're still tracking it. So as we go back to this tracker, we're going to update this as we review them. Again, your more critical vendors, you may want to review more often. I do call this continuous. So have conversations with the departments that use these things. A lot of times when you're enhancing your business continuity, plan, your instant response plan, your things throughout the year, you may come across some of these tools, some of these vendors that we use, and make sure they're still operating the way they're supposed to. It's a good chance that when you review those, you can also review these. It gives you a second chance, every year of reviewing these. So vendor management and how it ties into enterprise risk management. Again, we talked about risk a lot. I think when you're talking about vendor management, you are talking about risk. And part of that, enterprise risk management is that access control, right? Is that third party access. So when we're partnering with somebody, I'm going to give them access to our systems, to our data. How do they get that access? Who is governing that access? Who approves that access? Is that approved by you in security? Is that approved by the hiring manager? Who's approving that? And again, it should be multiple levels. At that point, we want to review that access. How long do they need that access for? How often are they accessing it? What's the expected outcome? Again, it's one of those things that I said I'm gonna say over and over and over. What's the expected outcome? Should they be accessing it once a month, twice a month? When is it just, you never know when it's going to be? Can you review that access? Where do those logs come from? Those logs come from their systems. Can you get them on your systems? What time are they accessing? Are they ever stopping the access? I've seen where somebody would access our systems and they leave the connection up for 18 hours, which means it's not disabling the access. So there's a risk there. So we want to make sure we bring that up. So if we're not monitoring, if we're not reviewing what's actually happening on our systems as it relates to our third parties and our vendors, we're ignoring risk again. And again, something that we do not want to do. So again, understand, document. When you go back to that tracker, I see who the admin is. I know who's responsible for tracking the access to that system. I know who's responsible for reviewing who has access. And I know who's responsible for logging and reviewing those logs or sending me those logs so I can review them. They're the ones that can pull those logs. I'm not an administrator, right? I'm separating that responsibility. They can pull the logs, they're the administrator. I'll review those logs for them and making sure there's no anomalies from what the expected outcome should be. Should write down how many times I say expected outcome. Probably get quite a few. And then that last, SSO, single sign-on and MFA. Again, we like that layered security. I use the term, zero trust a lot, as I'm sure a lot of you guys do. I tell my sweet grandmother, not to trust anybody who calls trying to sell her something or knocking the door, because she's so nice that she'll give money to anybody, unfortunately. But that single sign-on, that MFA, that's that zero trust, right? That's that making sure that if we're going to give somebody access, they're not just using a username and a password, because they're not in our domain, they're not in our system, they're not under our control, directly. So make sure they have that extra step to validate that it's them. And truthfully, compromise of username and password is still the number one way of compromise, or having a breach. So we want to make sure that we have that extra layer. Single sign-on again is great. We can kill everyone's access, with one, full swoop. Harder with vendor access, to have that SSO. But again, everything can be managed and as long as it's set up properly.
Hey, CJ.
Yeah.
There was another question in the chat about how should a due diligence review be done for every vendor, or should this occur based on a set frequency determined by vendor risk, or should it be determined annually, but the level of effort involved vary depending on vendor risk rating?
Yeah,
or ranking.
Yep. Yeah. Great question. And first thing I'll say is start with your policy. So you should have a security policy that will dictate what the occurrence is. For low and medium, I would say annual. Annual is, again, we want to look everything at least annually, whether it's medium or low. Now for your critical vendors and your high vendors, it depends. So like I said, there's certain vendors that I put in a critical category that I review once every 6 months, specifically. But as I said, I also review them throughout the year. So when we stagger, if you think about the way you would stagger things, so if I stagger my vendor reviews and I stagger my business continuity plan review and I stagger my incident response plan review, well, I'm technically reviewing those 3 times a year, because I'm gonna be talking about the people who administer, who monitor those tools, who use those tools during that business continuity review, during that incident response review. So I'm going to get answers on that, and that ties to a lot of our critical systems and our critical vendors. So not only am I reviewing them during the annual vendor management review, vendor review, but I'm also reviewing them as we're having the discussions during the business impact analysis, identifying what our critical systems are, what our RPOs and RTOs are, as it relates to how often we need it, and are they meeting our expectations. So that's how I approach it. Most policies that I see are reviewing your vendors on an annual basis. Some will say identifying, reviewing your critical, your high risk vendors on a semi or a quarterly basis. Hope that answers your question. So vendor management and risk, I get to this one already. So vendor management, risk, enterprise risk management. So again, we talked about this in the last slide, and we're going to kind of continue it here. That enterprise risk management is based on your overall risk appetite. And, kind of the last question that we got about how often you review it, again, to me, this ties to your organization. How risk averse are you? If you are, in this blue category all the way to the right, where you take extreme caution and accept as little risk as possible, your policy is going to say that you're going to review vendors more frequently. If you're more on this green side, which again, I think if I asked any organization I work with, or before I worked with them, where do you fit on this level? Almost all of them say risk neutral, or they say moderately risk averse. I don't think anybody I've ever talked to that thinks that they're risk seeking, and they may not realize that they're risk tolerant. But they'll probably all say that we try to take a balanced approach. A lot of it ties to money, as you can see, as I've listed in the bottom here. But again, a lot of that, how you approach things, what your policies state, is going to be based on what your risk appetite is, how much risk you are willing to take, and a lot of that starts at the top. Security. It unfortunately crosses over with operations. Some security will impact operations. How much are you willing to allow it to impact operations? What's that balance between accepting risk to ensure that operations isn't impacted, isn't affected, negatively? There's some organizations that don't care, and they're going to make every employee jump through hoops just to maintain that security. Again, I like to see it because I'm a security guy. But again, I think how often you're going to review and to what depth you're going to review your vendors is going to be based on what your risk appetite is as an organization and how that's communicated from the top. If you have a vendor request process, if you go through a ticketing system, if you have all those things we talked about with having a business case and having a financial review, and it's part of your strategic planning, and you do a security review, and they allow you to reject a vendor or go with a vendor that may be more expensive because you're getting a better product or there's less risk involved, then you probably have a company that's more on that blue side. If not, if they say, listen, this is the best price, this is the lowest bidder, we don't really care about the risk, we're not really even reviewing them, just kind of turn a blind eye to this, we just, we need this to go forward, and we don't have the money to do something else. Well, you're not necessarily risk seeking, but you're certainly risk tolerant. And again, a lot of that ties to money, unfortunately. And I think it all ties to what your organization's culture is. And as any of us know in the security field know, that's communicated from the top. If management doesn't buy into security and to that culture, then it's going to spread out the entire organization, and you're not going to care until it's probably too late, or you're being reactive to something that happened, whether it was internal with your own environment, or it was external from a vendor, or some other third party. So as we wrap up, again, vendor management strategy. Does your company have one? Again, having the conversation, that we had on here was great. And again, it sounds like you guys have one, and it's kind of great to hear it that you're using a ticketing system and it's part of your strategic planning. And again, understanding that it maybe doesn't always work perfectly. Maybe you are being reactionary sometimes, but it sounds like you do have one. And again, one of the things that when we go build a program, with the practice that I run here, vendor management is always high on that build part of our program. And again, who's responsible? The answer is everybody. Anybody who uses that vendor. That's that transparency we talked about. If you see something not acting the way it should, if you're not getting the expected outcome that you're supposed to see, you need to say something, and that's part of that vendor review process, right? That's for me. That's why I'm doing it throughout the year with my BCP review, with my IRP review, with my other plans, my other vendor reviews. So I'm hitting it multiple times a year and talking to the people that maybe I wouldn't normally talk to about the tools that they're using. That vendor approval, again, going back to that vendor management strategy, it's a part of it, and it's 3-layered. For me, it's business case. For me, it's cost, and for me, it's security. And then tracking it. Again, the bigger the organization, the more vendors you have. The more vendors you have, maybe the more departments you have, the harder it is to manage that inventory, and whether we have something that exists already. So if you're the one managing that inventory, understanding what each tool does, being able to track it, and comparing it if somebody puts in a vendor request. I'm saying that risk review, like I said, it's continuous. Your policy can say annual, your policy can say semi-annual. can say biannual. I should say at least annual, to comply with most frameworks and regulations. But that review is continuous. If somebody has a problem with a particular vendor, you want to hear about it. And again, it may not be you first. But hopefully you're in the meetings. Hopefully they know that this is something you're looking at. Maybe you're asking the questions, but that's where that transparency comes back. We want multiple people looking at this and kind of coming back, and it comes up at those, steering committee meetings, comes at those, business strategy meetings, to where we know that a vendor is not performing up to par. And then how it all ties your enterprise risk management. Again, we talked about this kind of ad nauseum, but we don't want to we don't want to ignore any risk. We can accept risk. We can document that risk. If we have one with a vendor, we want to document it. We want to track it. We want to make sure it's improving or it's staying, where in the appropriate level. But we do not want to ignore it. So again, a lot of this falls into the enterprise risk management. What's the culture at your organization? Can you change that culture? What kind of impact can you make on ensuring that culture exists? So with that, I'm going to take a final drink of water. Thank you all for being a part of this, and give you some time to ask a question or two or three or 10.
Are there any best practices on vendor access reviews?
Yes, there absolutely is. I think a lot of what I shared, fall into those best practices. And again, I guess, talking to you, Josh, where they're asking to share, I can share them, physically. But again, I think a lot of what we've hit on with that due diligence, with, again, having a request, having the different layers of approval, having the continuous review. Again, I think the staggered review is again, has worked great for me, and make sure we're capturing it multiple times a year. But make sure your policy really is helping to dictate what you're supposed to do. Make sure you're identifying the risk level of a vendor. And again, I personally really focus on the criticality to my organization. I think if you find a high risk vendor, if I saw somebody label something as a critical vendor, it's a critical risk. I'm like, oh, what does this mean? Well, they don't have any security. They don't have any security controls. They don't have any security program. But we went with them because they were basically free. So we label them critical. We're going to keep an eye on them. It's like, okay, how often do you review them? We review them annually. Well, why would you even review or approve a critical vendor that has such a high risk because they have no program? I'd like to think that you would just deny them. So again, identify the criticality to your organization to understand what they have access to. Make sure. So again, when we talk about those best practices, I think that's a big part of that. The approval process, the continuous review process, and identifying that criticality, putting a rating to them.